rivalries are massive, especially with two players and all that. Can you imagine the big rivalries? You have George Mikan versus anybody who would stand up to the fans. You had Bill Russell versus Will Chamberlain in the 1960s. You had pretty much Kareem Abdul-Jabbar versus Robert the Chief Parrish. You had like Willis Reed versus probably Oscar Robertson. And in the 90s, you had MJ versus uh, Nick Anderson. Well, I mean, sorry, MJ versus Penny Hardaway. You have Shaq versus anybody. And then you had Kobe versus like Jason Kidd, all that. But for everyone's money, the 1980s were about the Lakers Celtics rivalry, but it was with a massive Eastern Conference rivalry between two players. You had the speed and finesse from the hick from French Lick, Larry Bird, against the human highlight film who did well in slam dunk competitions and brought slam dunking back to the prominence of the NBA. His name, Dominique Wilkins. So Bird versus Wilkins is the premise of this what if. It's talking about the 1988 Atlanta Hawks and what if they actually did take care of Larry Bird. We're playing basketball Sims. We're playing basketball Sims. He's playing what if NBA. Cutter's doing what if NBA. Yeah. Oh, all the teams around the world got to know that the Raptors are number one. But what about the Bulls, Wizards, and Pistons? They all have great what ifs. What is stories about old teams like the Kansas City Kings and maybe even the Minneapolis Lakers. But we all know we're gonna do some basketball. He's doing basketball. He's doing basketball. What ifs? Cutter's doing what if NBA? So what if NBA? So the history of the Atlanta Hawks is kind of a weird one. It doesn't start in Atlanta. It starts in 1950 with a team called the Tri Cities Blackhawks. Now, of course, if you're a Tri Cities guy and you live in Kitchener Waterloo, you're thinking Kitchener Waterloo, Cambridge. But no, the Tri Cities were the team for Atlanta. And you know how the Hawks were and all that. So their franchise start in the Tri Cities Blackhawks. They would play in an area, two Illinois cities, Moline and Rock Island, and also Davenport, Iowa. So then they would be relocated to Moline and all that. The Tri Cities Blackhawks actually nearly had Bob Cousy. They drafted him, but they couldn't get a player deal with Cousy, so they traded him to the Chicago Stags when Chicago had a team in the NBA in the 50s. And then once the Stags folded, the Celtics got him in the dispersal draft. Unfortunately for the Tri Cities team, they couldn't make the ends meet, so they moved to Milwaukee to become the Milwaukee Hawks. Spent 5 years in Milwaukee and then left for St. Louis, more Midwest, back to the Midwest, and the St. Louis Hawks were around for 13 years. You'd be thinking, oh, well, St. Louis NBA team sucked. No, they didn't. They won the 1958 championship over the Boston Celtics. That was big because that was the last time anyone won the NBA title until 1967 that wasn't named the Boston Celtics. The Celtics won 8 straight championships at that time. St. Louis was starting to lose their money and all that and would actually end up moving to Atlanta. Atlanta bought the Hawks and moved it to the southeastern United States, where they have been ever since in 1968. Atlanta enjoyed themselves. In 1966, they got the Milwaukee Braves, so they got another Midwestern team to move to Atlanta, that being the Hawks. Atlanta in the 70s were okay. Pete Maravich played a few years there. but they just weren't that big. But in the 1980s, they got Dominique Wilkins from the University of Georgia. They made some big moves, and they were decent. They were a good Eastern Conference team. Unfortunately for them, they weren't the super team. And in the 90s, they had Dikembe Mutombo, Steve Smith, and a few other Atlanta players to complement it, but the Hawks just couldn't get past MJ. The 2000s, they were decent. 2010s, not so bad either. They once had the number one seed in the Eastern Conference, which was unusual. But in 2020, Trey Young became a massive figure for the Hawks, and his number 11 would be always there with his cold shoulder thing at Madison Square Garden against the New York Knicks, knocking them out of the playoffs and all that. The Hawks have been a pretty good team recently. So anyway, let's take a look at the 1988 Hawks. All right, so the 1988 Hawks, 39th season in the NBA and the 20th season in Atlanta. They got off to a terrible start, then won 16 out of their next 18. They won 50 games, finishing third in the Central Division. But Dominique was huge, 30.7 points per game, all NBA second team. And yes, this was the season in which Dominique and MJ had that massive slam dunk competition. One of the greatest final two slam dunk stuff till 2016 with Aaron Gordon going toe to toe with Zach LaVine in T Dot. Of course, it's a little bit biased because, I'm from Toronto, but whatever. They had a good bench too. Doc Rivers, yes, that Doc Rivers was also a good player for the Hawks. In the first round, the Hawks took care of Milwaukee, although it took the 5 games to do so because practically, the Bucks were hard to beat. In the Eastern semifinals, they were up 3 games to 2 on Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics, so it looked good for the Hawks to actually pull off a conference finals spot. But they would lose on home turf in a tight game 6, 102-100. But little did people know that game 7 would be much bigger because it was one of the biggest games around. It was Dominique versus Larry Bird. It was a massive duel at high noon on CBS with Brent Musburger and Tom Heinsohn behind the mic. It was amazing. The fourth quarters by both these guys. It's a duel. Put down your swords, as Heinsohn would say. It was 118-116, the final score for the Celtics. Dominique Wilkins never got to the conference finals in his career. That's a shame. So anyway, I can't remember who was the next team play. Well, we'll get to the playoff bracket later. Anyway, back the player draft was more than just 2 rounds. They drafted players. They didn't really draft anyone major. They drafted people from 6 countries: US, China, Greece, Spain, Italy, and Croatia. The 1988 Hawks had John Battle, Anton Carr, Scott Hastings from Arkansas, Sweet, John Concat, Cliff Livingston, a good player from Wichita, Doc Rivers from Marquette, Tree Rollins, a sprawling 7'1" center, one of the best around, Chris Washburn from NC State. Unfortunately, Washburn came with a drug problem, and I think he got expelled from the NBA, if memory serves me right. Spud Webb from NC State, he was only 5'6", and a slam dunk competition winner in 1986. Dominique, the human highlight film. Kevin Willis, a good guy from Michigan State. Randy Whitman, and Leon Wood. In the regular season, they would tie Chicago for second place, but Chicago beat them on a tiebreak. The Celtics were number 1. The Pistons were number 2 in the East. Atlanta was 4. Would have had to play the 5 seed Milwaukee Bucks. It was actually crazy. 11 teams in the East, 8 made it. But Washington, New York, and Indy all won 38 games, and somehow Indy missed out. I don't know what the tiebreak was. Philly only had 36 the season after Dr. J retired, and the Nets were just pathetic. So in the first round, they would face Milwaukee. They won all their games at home, but on the road, they just couldn't do it. It was the best. And then the Eastern semifinals, they lost the first 2 games, and then would play game 3 at home. One game 3, 4, 5. But then game 6, they lost at 1 o'clock. And then at high noon, in Boston. It was one of the best duels of all time. But unfortunately for the Hawks, it just wasn't meant to be. So anyway, what would happen if about the 1988 Hawks if they made the conference finals and helped Dominique? All right, so the 88 Hawks would have faced the 88 Detroit Pistons. Of course, we don't ruin the other semifinals. So Hawks would have faced the Pistons. And yet the Detroit Pistons in real life did go to the 1988 finals and lost game 7. Anyway, game 1 would see the Hawks get their butts handed in 107-97's Bill Laimbeer, 14 points, 12 rebounds. 26 points from Kevin Willis, 21 from Dominique Rivers, 8 Whitman, 15 Tree Royals, only 2 points, 4 personal fouls. Livingston Concat battles. There's Scott Hastings. 10 points for Livingston off the bench. Isaiah Thomas, Bill Laimbeer, Joel Dumars, Adrian Dantley, and Rick Mahorn playing there. Of course, this was the season before the Pistons traded away Dantley to Dallas for the want of one guy that I can't think of off the top of my head. Why can I not think of it? Detroit made the trade with a Geyer. Dennis Rodman, yes, he was around that year, 1988, 15 points in 15 points, 25 minutes off the bench. Fitting the microwave Johnson, 12 points off the bench in 22 minutes. James Edwards, William Bedford, Ralph Lewis, and John Spider Sally. Game 2 would see the Hawks lose closely. Isaiah, 21 points, 10 assists. 35 from Dominique in 41 minutes. He knew he had to play. Spud Webb played 15 minutes. Yeah, I think Chris Washburn got kicked out of the league. Right. Yeah, those Ralph Lewis, Spider Sally only getting 1 minute. 6 points by Mahorn in 31 minutes. Well, Rodman had 12 in 23 minutes. Rodman should be the starter. But no, sir. No way. Game 3 would see the Hawks come home and win 110-90 as Dominique put up 30 points. Dumars only put up 18. Rodman 12 points off the bench. Yeah, Chuck Nevitt, Ron Moore, Daryl Dawkins played for the 1988 Pistons. And Walker Russell. Yeah, you know, Daryl Dawkins smashing those boards. Mike McGee, Leon Wood, and Enos Watley doing it. And I think McGee and Watley were once on the 88 Hawks and then they got traded. Game 4 would be the Pistons winning 121-102 as Laimbeer put up 19 points, 13 rebounds, trying to close down Atlanta. They had laid 21 points, 19 points by microwave in 21 minutes off the bench. Wow. Dominique put up 44 points. Not enough. There's John Battle. So game 5 in Detroit, the 2-2-1-1-1 system. We'll see the Hawks get their butts handed to them 115-105 as Bill Laimbeer did his job, 20 points, 12 rebounds, and the Pistons would have made this championship just like in real life. So that's what would happen. The Pistons win 115-105, and that was that. 23 from Dominique, 12 from Battle off the bench, 23 from Dantley. Rodman, 18 points off the bench. Man, Dennis Rodman should be a starter, but no, I think Mahorn and Laimbeer were the starters behind him. Yeah, Rodman, as bad as he wants to be. And the Pistons would have lost the championship in real life. So Dominique would try to make the finals, but he wouldn't, unfortunately. Anyhow, I'm Jeff Diamond. Adieu.